Hello, friends. So in this video, I want to talk about Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, which is the gospel reading for the fourth Sunday of Advent in lectionary year A. So let's just start with reading some of the passage. This is how the birth of Jesus Christ took place. When Mary, his mother, was engaged to Joseph, before they were married, she became pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, was a righteous man. Because he didn't want to humiliate her, he decided to call off their engagement quietly. As he was thinking about this, an angel from the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, because the child she carries was conceived by the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you will call him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." Now all of this took place so that what the Lord had spoken through the prophet would be fulfilled. "Look, a virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel." Emmanuel means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did just as an angel from God commanded and took Mary as his wife, but he didn't have sexual relations with her until she gave birth to a son. Joseph called him Jesus. If you've already watched the video on the synoptic problem, then you already know that this material is unique to the Gospel of Matthew, which I think is pretty exciting because it gives us sort of a view into Matthew's Gospel in particular and the particular ways that he's interested in presenting Jesus. Again, as I talked about in that video, a lot of commonalities with the other Gospels, but there are also these just little differences between the Gospels too that give us a sort of different view of who Jesus is. And so, of course, you do have a birth narrative in Luke, unlike Mark and John. So there are similarities there between Matthew and Luke. But uh, the way that Matthew talks about Jesus' birth is quite different from Luke, as you can see if you compare the first couple chapters of Luke to this passage in Matthew. And actually, what follows on this in the beginning of chapter 2 with the flight to Egypt, like all of that is unique to Matthew as well. And so I'm not going to talk about that in this video, but that passage is really interesting and thinking about the particular view that Matthew is giving of Jesus. There's a lot of material. There's just a lot to potentially talk about in this particular passage in Matthew 1. I mean, you could do all kinds of stuff with Joseph's sort of faithfulness here and the way that he listens to the angel's command and things like that. So there's, I think, lots of ways you could go with this passage, but I'm going to hone in on this quotation right here from the book of Isaiah that Matthew uses. I think for two reasons. One, I'm just always super interested in the way New Testament authors use the Old Testament. That's sort of one of the things I really enjoy digging into. So maybe some of it's just my own personal interest, but I also do think that this quotation helps us get to at least what I see as really the heart of this passage. That again, there's lots of things you could talk about here that are really interesting. Lots of ways you can preach and teach from this passage. But I do tend to think that this quotation really gets at the heart of what this passage is about. So this quotation comes from Isaiah chapter 7. And I've got some of Isaiah chapter 7 here. I couldn't fit all of it on here. So I'd encourage you to just open your Bible to Isaiah chapter 7 and read verses 1 through 14 so you can really get a sense of what this whole passage is about. But I've put some of it on here so that we can get some context for what's going on here. So you see right here in the first verses, you kind of get a summary of the situation of Isaiah. In the days of Ahaz, son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah. Okay, so Ahaz is king of Judah, and you see Judah right here on the map, right? So during the reign of Ahaz, king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram, which on this map is called Syria, so you can see that right there. Aram and Syria are sort of synonyms for the same area in this time period. And King Pekah, son of Remaliah of Israel, and so you see that right here, went up to attack Jerusalem. And now remember, Jerusalem is in Judah, right? So it's sort of right on the border between Israel and Judah. It's right here at the northern part of Judah, and it's the capital of Judah, right? Now, you might be saying to yourself, like, Israel and Judah, it's a divided nation, but at one time these were united, right? Israel and Judah were one nation under David, under Saul and David and Solomon, right? And so you would think they would be kind of allies. Why is, they're both God's people in the Old Testament, right? why in the world is Israel ganging up with Syria or Aram to attack Judah? Well, this big blue mass right over here is your answer. The empire of Assyria, really one of the world's first great empires. Just great, I mean, in terms of its power, not necessarily its moral quality. But Assyria was the superpower of the region at the time, as is well represented in the space that it takes up on this map, right? And so all these little nations, Syria, Israel, Judah, the other nations that are around here, they're all living under the shadow of Assyria, right? To live in this region is to have to negotiate Assyrian power. And when I say negotiate Assyrian power, what I mean is you basically have to decide, are you going to submit to them? Are you going to pay them tribute, a kind of tax, right? Or are you going to fight them? Are you going to try to resist them? And most of these nations had been what we would call vassal states, right? They weren't sort of like directly ruled by Assyria, but they were sort of like block countries, if I can borrow language from the time of the Soviet Union, right? They are under Assyria's influence. Well, King Pekah of Israel and King Rezin of Aram or Syria decides they don't want to do that anymore. And so they decide they're going to form an alliance and try to throw off Assyrian control, and they want Judah to join them. But Ahaz doesn't want to join them. He's like, no, fighting against Assyria is suicide. Why would we do that? So Judah doesn't want to join them. And so Israel and Syria try to force Judah's hand and actually attack Jerusalem. This is often referred to as the Syro-Ephraimite War. Syrio because of Syrian, Ephraimite being a sort of synonym for the northern tribes of Israel. And so this Syro-Ephraimite War, this happens sometime around 734 BC or slightly after, because 734 is when it's thought that King Pekah comes to power in Israel. So it's either in 734 or shortly thereafter that Israel and Syria attack Judah and attempt to, well, when I say force them to join the alliance, probably what they want to do is remove Ahaz from the throne and put somebody on the throne who will then join their alliance, right? And so that they can fight against Assyria. But you can see that it says they couldn't conquer it, right? They were unable to make this happen. And so if we go back to verse 2 up here, when the house of David, which that's Ahaz, right? Because Ahaz is the descendant of David. He's the one who sits on the throne of Judah. Heard that Aram had allied itself with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. In other words, they're terrified, right? So, I mean, everybody's terrified of Assyria, right? But in this time period, it's not like Judah and Israel are sort of like equals. Israel is the more powerful nation, right? And so Israel allied with Syria or allied with Aram coming against Judah, they have good reason to be shaking like trees in the forest in the midst of the wind, right? That these are two superior powers that are coming against them. And I mean, really, if you try to imagine, put yourself in Ahaz's shoes, right? He's in an impossible situation here where it's like he's got these two smaller powers that are both more powerful than him coming after him, but they want to force him to fight against this even bigger power in Assyria. And so, quite frankly, Ahaz has good reason to be terrified, right? This is not a good situation for him to be in. You skip a couple verses down, and we get to the part where we have the quotation in Matthew. So again the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or high as heaven, right? So God is actually telling Ahaz, you can ask for a sign. And Ahaz, very piously responds, I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test, which is actually like in line with Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy says, don't put the Lord your God to the test. So Ahaz's response is actually kind of faithful in a way, but Isaiah, or God through Isaiah, seems to be frustrated because God has offered a sign and Ahaz doesn't want to take it. So in verse 13, then Isaiah said, Hear then, O house of David, right? Because again, Ahaz is David's descendant. Is it too little for you to weary mortals that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel, right? So right here you have the part that's quoted in the book of Matthew. Now, again, I couldn't fit this whole chapter on here and fit all the other things I wanted to provide as well. But if you keep reading the chapter, you'll see that what's going on here is that the birth of this child in the context of Isaiah, right? Like just set aside Matthew for a minute because I know we hear this passage and we just automatically think about Jesus, and with good reason, right? But in the context of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah is not talking about Jesus in that specific context, right? We'll get to that in a little bit. In the context of the Syro-Ephraimite war and the situation that we see in Isaiah 7, what Isaiah seems to be saying, and if you keep reading in the verses after what I have here, uh, Isaiah is basically saying this child is going to be a sign that God is with you in the midst of this impossible situation, and that God is going to deliver you from this impossible situation, right? Because Isaiah goes on to say, or God says through the prophet Isaiah, that by the time that this child, that is the birth is being predicted here in this verse, by the time this child is old enough to tell good from evil, so, as he starts to mature and he's a few years old, that by that time, the nations you fear will be nothing, the prophet says, right? So right now you're afraid of Syria and Israel, but he's saying, but in just a few years, those nations will be laid waste. And in fact, that is what happens because Assyria comes and says, hey, you tried to rebel against me. We're not having any of that. And so then Syria and Israel become even more directly under the control of Assyria. Judah is certainly under the influence of Assyria as well, but maintains slightly more level of independence because they didn't rebel against Assyria. So that's what's happening in the context of Isaiah, is that King Ahaz is terrified because these two kings of these nations that are stronger than him are coming against him and trying to force him to join an alliance against a mighty empire. And he's like, this is crazy. I don't want any part of this, right? Just kind of leave me alone. And so through the prophet Isaiah, God says, uh, the young woman is going to be with child and will bear a son, and by the time that he's old enough to tell right from wrong, the two nations you fear will be laid waste. And so the name is child, and let me try that again. The child is named Emmanuel, meaning God with us, because the child himself is a sign that God is with Judah in the midst of this impossible situation and is going to get Judah through this impossible situation, and that Ahaz doesn't need to be afraid. Even though, sort of real politic, right? Like if you were looking at this from a purely sort of secular standpoint, he had good reason to be afraid. But God, through the prophet Isaiah, is saying, you don't need to be afraid because these kingdoms you fear are going to come to nothing. All right, so what does all that mean then for talking about the context in Matthew here? Well, I want to dive into the quotation just a little bit more and note a couple things. I think first I'll just mention what I have right here, right? A little bit of Greek and Hebrew for you. So it says, look, a virgin, you notice Matthew's version, when Matthew quotes this, he says, look, a virgin will become pregnant. And you might have noticed that here in the Isaiah text, it actually says the young woman, right? So there's some Greek and Hebrew stuff going on here, and that is that the Hebrew word that Isaiah uses is Alma. So you see I have that right here, Alma, which actually can mean virgin, but it sort of more typically is just generally talking about a young woman, right? And so that's why most English translations translate Isaiah that way. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible or of the Old Testament, which is referred to as the Septuagint, that comes from, that name Septuagint comes from the number 70. And so sometimes you will see Septuagint abbreviated as it is here, LXX, which is the Roman numeral for the number 70. And the reason it's named after 70 is because the sort of legend that goes along with this Greek translation is that 70 Jewish scholars got together to work on the translation, and they all worked on the translation of the Torah, the first the 5 books of Moses, independently. And when they came back together, they all had exactly the same translation from Hebrew into Greek. Well, if you know anything about working in multiple languages, if you're multilingual, or even if you've just dipped your toes in working in multiple languages, like, you know, that's not a very likely outcome. In fact, we would say it was miraculous, right? That there are just too many translation decisions to make when you're moving from one language to another. Even if you just had two people working on it, it's extremely unlikely, I would say almost impossible, that they would actually come to the exact same word for word translation, much less if you had 70 people working on it, right? So I think the whole point of that story is that it's miraculous, right? It's the idea is supposed to be that God worked not only in the giving of the original Hebrew text, but that God led these 70 scholars in producing the Greek text, right? So I think that legend is meant to authorize the Greek text to say to Jewish people in the centuries before Jesus, or in the few centuries right before Jesus, you can trust this translation, right? Because God was at work in this translation in the same way. Now so when the Septuagint, this Greek version of the Old Testament, translates the Hebrew Alma, it uses this word Parthenos, which is specifically virgin. It's not the same general word like the Hebrew Alma, that where it can mean young woman or virgin. It means specifically virgin. You might think, for example, of the Parthenon in Athens, right? The temple to Athena. The reason it's called the Parthenon is because Athena was thought to be a virgin, right? So it's a temple to Athena Parthenos, right? So that's the same word that's used here, and that is the word that Matthew uses when he quotes from Isaiah, because Matthew is reading the Septuagint, right? Matthew is reading the Old Testament. He's reading Isaiah in Greek. He's not reading it in Hebrew. And so let me just pause here for a moment and say, you might think, well, why does any of this matter? Like, who even cares about the Greek translation, right? After all, it's a translation. Isn't the Hebrew what's original? Isn't that what we want to focus on? That's the oldest text. That's the original text. And that's all true. The Hebrew is older and more original. But it turns out that the Greek translation of the Old Testament is actually pretty important, and this is a key text as to why it's so important. And that is that the early Christians, including the New Testament writers, most of them weren't reading the Hebrew Bible, right? When they were reading the Hebrew Scriptures, they were reading it in Greek. Oh, sorry. Uh, they were reading it in Greek. They were reading the Septuagint. And we can see that here with Matthew, that Matthew is reading the Septuagint. And of course, this goes on to be really significant in Christian doctrine, right? Because even the Nicene Creed says he was born of a virgin, right? So this translation of the Septuagint and then how it comes through in Matthew's quotation here is really significant for later Christian doctrine, because Matthew, of course, is taking this prophecy from Isaiah and applying it to Mary and the birth of Jesus, that Mary was a virgin and gave birth to Jesus without ever having sexual relations with Joseph. Now, that's all somewhat technical, and you may not bring up those specifics in your teaching or your preaching or however you're using this text, and that's perfectly fine. But I think it's a good thing for us to be aware of as we're thinking about this text. That the Greek Septuagint is actually really significant here. And I think it also, at least in my mind, is really important when we think about how Matthew, and I would say the New Testament writers generally, but in this case, Matthew in particular, how Matthew is working with prophecy, right? Because clearly he is using this text in a very different way than its original context in Isaiah, right? We've seen that in Isaiah, the meaning of this prophecy is about that Syro-Ephraimite war. It is about, hey, these nations you're afraid of, you don't have to fear them because they're going to be laid to waste soon, and you don't even have to worry about it, and God is with you, right? Matthew is using those words to say something quite different, right? I mean, there's similarities and differences, right? It still has to do with the birth of a child. It still very much has to do with God being with us, but in a very different way, right? That now Matthew is taking this prophecy, and at least I don't assume Matthew's unaware of the context from Isaiah, but he's saying, look, God is acting in a new way, in a way that is both continuous with the way that God acted in the past, but also doing something very new, right? That the Virgin Mary is going to be with child and is going to give birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel, which means God with us, which I think is really the heart of this passage, that what Matthew and Isaiah have in common is that the birth of this child represents God being with us, or maybe represents isn't even really strong enough of a word, right? Like that in the incarnation, in the birth of Jesus, God is in fact taking on our flesh. So I find this First Nations version of this verse really helpful. So if you're not familiar with this, there's a First Nations New Testament. And so it is a translation of the New Testament produced by indigenous people as an attempt to reflect indigenous ways of reading scripture and indigenous culture. So it's a pretty interesting translation. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't seen it before, and at least give some of it a read and see what you think of it. But one of the things that I found most valuable in reading through this First Nations version of the New Testament is I love what it does with this verse, right? That it translates verse 22 of Matthew chapter 1 this way. It says, "This gave full meaning to the words of Creator spoken long ago by the prophet." And the reason I like that translation so much is because I think it actually captures really well the way Matthew uses prophecy. So Matthew, this sort of formula here, where Matthew says this happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Matthew says that over and over again, right? Like this is a characteristic of his gospel. This isn't the only place that he does it. Matthew does it more than the other gospel writers. It's like a characteristic of his gospel that he's repeatedly saying this happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. And I think sometimes when we read that, we can easily get the idea that it's like, okay, so there was a sort of prophetic checklist, right? That this is what the Messiah would be. Like, that you just have this list of things of what to expect with the Messiah, and that Jesus just checks all those off, right? And so then that's how we know that he's the Messiah. And I actually think that's wrong. I don't think that's what Matthew intends. I don't think that helps us theologically. I think that misunderstands what the New Testament is doing with these prophetic texts. I think the relationship actually works the other way around. It's not that you have these Old Testament prophetic texts that, oh, you can just create a messianic checklist of what the Messiah is supposed to be, and then, oh, look, Jesus checks all those off. Because actually, most of the messianic expectations that first century Jews had, Jesus doesn't fulfill. I mean, let me just say that very plainly, right? Like, most of the things that most first century Jews, I mean, first century Jews are not a monolithic group, they have different beliefs, right? But most first century Jews are, when they think about the Messiah, they're expecting somebody like David, right? They're expecting a sort of warrior king who's going to provide peace for the nation of Israel and maybe kick the Romans out of town and maybe provide some independence so that God can rule in Israel again, right? And let's just say very plainly that like Jesus doesn't really do anything like that, right? He does it, we might say metaphorically or spiritually, right? He provides peace and he brings God's kingdom to earth, but He doesn't take up a sword to fight the Romans, right? He doesn't lead a rebellion. He doesn't come in on a white horse. He doesn't lead an army against Rome, right? So Jesus quite simply doesn't fulfill most of first century Jewish expectations about what the Messiah would be. In fact, a really important point of the Gospels is that he turns most of them on their head, right? He takes most of those expectations and turns them upside down. Instead, he fulfills passages like the suffering servant passages in Isaiah 52 and 53, right? Uh, for our transgressions, he was wounded. By his stripes, we are healed, right? This humble servant who comes to serve instead of leading an army. But nobody was reading Isaiah 52, at least nobody, that we're aware of. There's no literary evidence that anybody was reading Isaiah 52 and 53 as a messianic text, right? Like nobody was looking at that and going, oh, this is what the Messiah is going to look like. Instead, what happens is early Christians, early Jesus followers, have the experience of Jesus that they have, and they go look at these remarkable things that the God of Israel is doing through Jesus, and they go, he must be the Messiah. And so then they read Jesus back into certain texts, right? It's a complete rereading of the Hebrew Scriptures, right? It's not like Jesus fulfills the Scriptures so much as we're rereading the Scriptures through the lens of Jesus, right? And so that's why I think this First Nation version captures that. It's not just this prediction fulfillment formula, it's this gave full meaning to the words that the Creator spoke through the prophet long ago, right? It's the prophecy of Isaiah had meaning in the 8th century, right? It had meaning to Ahaz and to Isaiah and to the people who lived in that time. And that meaning was God is with you and you will survive this impossible situation, right? But now it has new meaning in the person of Jesus. The meaning gets filled up. The Jesus' birth gave even fuller meaning to the words of the Creator, right? That they take on entirely new meaning in Jesus. And yet, even as it takes on this new meaning, it's still the same meaning in some way, right? Because the message is still God is with you and will get you through this impossible situation, right? Whether that is sort of directly to Mary and Joseph, who find themselves in a impossible situation, right? Or to humanity as a whole, right? And so I think that's what really gets to the heart of this passage. In this fourth week of Advent, the theme is love, right? And I think that this passage points us towards the tremendous love of God, specifically in the incarnation, right? In God taking on human flesh in the person of Jesus, that God is with us in a way that exceeds our greatest expectations, right? That it was one really remarkable thing for God to say to the people of Judah, God is with you, Emmanuel, right? God is with us in this impossible situation. But now God is with humanity in a completely new and I mean, how do you even what adjectives do you use, right? Like this new and remarkable and unexpected way, to the point that God has actually taken on human flesh, right? God has bound God's self in the very flesh and blood of humanity. And really nothing could speak more loudly God's love, God's willingness to be with us, God's not even willingness, God's commitment, God's covenant to always be bound to us, right? Because I don't think Jesus stops having human flesh when he's resurrected and when he ascends into heaven. I think human flesh is now bound up in the life of the triune God in the person of the Son, in the person of Jesus. And so there is this sense that through the incarnation, God is forever with us in ways that no one could have even imagined, right? And that, I think, is the heart of this message in Matthew chapter 1, and in many ways, the heart of the Christian message as a whole. That God's love for us is so great that God is with us, even to the point of binding God's self to our own flesh and blood for all eternity. That is the great extent of God.